Before there was writing, there was story. Before agriculture, before cities, before the wheel, before almost every technology that defines what we call civilization, human beings were sitting around fires, telling each other what had happened, what it meant, and what to do about it. They were doing what no other animal does with anything like the same complexity, sophistication, or obsessive dedication. They were making narrative sense of the world. This is not a trivial observation. The fact that story predates almost every other human technology tells you something fundamental about its role, not as entertainment, not as art for art's sake, but as a survival mechanism. A piece of cognitive equipment so essential to how the human mind works that understanding it reveals something fundamental about what we are and why we do almost everything we do. Let's start with a question that seems obvious but isn't: why do humans tell stories at all? The most straightforward answer comes from evolutionary anthropology. For most of human history, the most dangerous and the most important information was not factual data, it was situational knowledge. Which plants kill? Which animals respond to aggression and which respond to submission? Which behaviors cause a group to expel a member? Which leaders can be trusted? Which strangers are safe? None of this information could be conveyed efficiently through raw description. It required context, consequence, and character, which is to say, it required story. Researcher Jonathan Gottschall, in his work on the evolutionary function of narrative, argues that human beings are, as he calls it, the storytelling animal, uniquely and compulsively driven to impose narrative structure on experience. His research suggests that this drive is not culturally learned but biologically preset. Children who have never been taught about narrative spontaneously organize their experiences into stories. Dreams, the unconscious mind's activity during sleep, are almost universally structured as narrative. Even when nothing happens to us, we tell ourselves stories about nothing happening. The mind does not rest in raw experience. It immediately begins editing, organizing, and meaning-making, which is to say, narrating. But the evolutionary function of story goes deeper than information transmission. Neuroscientist Hasson at Princeton has demonstrated something remarkable about what happens to human brains when a story is told. When a speaker tells a story and a listener receives it, their brains, as measured by fMRI scanning, begin to synchronize. Not just in the language processing areas, but across multiple regions including the prefrontal cortex, the insula, and the posterior superior temporal sulcus. The brain of the listener begins to mirror the brain of the speaker. Hasson calls this neural coupling, the neural alignment of minds through shared narrative. This matters enormously because it suggests that story is not just a vehicle for information. It is a technology for creating shared mental states between people who may never have shared the same experience. A hunter who saw a predator behave in a particular way could, through story, transfer not just the facts of that encounter but something like the felt sense of it, the contextual, embodied, emotionally tagged experience that would allow another person to recognize and respond to the same predator correctly, even if they had never encountered it themselves. This is an extraordinary capacity. And it explains something about why fiction, which describes things that did not happen, is not a waste of cognitive resources but a simulation engine for experiences the reader has never had. When you read a novel, your brain is not simply processing words. It is running a simulation of the described experience, activating many of the same neural circuits that would be activated if the experience were actually occurring. Research by cognitive psychologist Raymond Mar and others has shown that habitual readers of fiction develop superior theory of mind, the ability to accurately infer and model other people's mental states, compared to non-readers. The fiction reader has practiced inhabiting other minds thousands of times. Their brain is more accurately calibrated to the reality of other people's inner lives. And theory of mind, as researchers who study social cognition are increasingly emphasizing, is not a peripheral skill. It is among the most important cognitive capacities a social primate can have. The ability to predict and model what other people are thinking, feeling, and intending, to navigate the extraordinarily complex social world of human beings, depends on this capacity. And story is, among other things, a delivery system for it. There is another dimension to the human need for narrative that the data from cognitive science makes very clear: the mind cannot tolerate the experience of meaninglessness. It actively, compulsively, and sometimes pathologically seeks narrative structure even where none exists. Psychologist Fritz Heider's classic experiment showed that people who watched abstract geometric shapes, triangles and circles moving across a screen, spontaneously attributed intentions, relationships, and narratives to those shapes. They saw a bully and a victim, a romance and an escape. The shapes were doing nothing. The minds watching them were doing everything. This tendency, what cognitive scientists call the narrative bias, means that the human mind is not a neutral receiver of experience. It is a story-generating machine. It takes raw input and immediately begins constructing a plot. And crucially, the plot it constructs determines how the experience is remembered, interpreted, and acted upon. The story you tell about an event is not a description of that event. It is your experience of that event. The two are not the same. This is why the stories we tell about ourselves are not neutral self-descriptions. They are the architecture of our identity. Psychologist Dan McAdams has spent decades studying what he calls the narrative self, the internalized life story that each person constructs, revises, and inhabits. His research shows that the specific narrative themes people use to structure their life story, whether they tend to see their life as a contamination sequence, things that were good turning bad, or a redemption sequence, things that were bad becoming sources of growth, are strongly predictive of psychological well-being, resilience, and long-term mental health. The story you are telling about your life is not just a story. It is shaping, in measurable and consequential ways, the actual texture of your life. And this creates both the power and the danger of narrative. The power, story is the medium through which meaning is made, identity is constructed, and connection between minds becomes possible. The danger, the stories we tell are always selective, always partial, always shaped by who is doing the telling and what they need the story to say. A story is a frame, and frames both illuminate and exclude. The story that makes you the hero of your own life necessarily makes someone else the obstacle or the villain. The story that makes suffering meaningful necessarily imposes a structure on events that may not be willing to hold that structure. This is why the philosopher Paul Ricoeur argued that the examined life is, in the deepest sense, a narrative achievement, the ongoing, effortful, honest work of revising the story you are telling about who you are and why, in light of new experience, new understanding, and other people's stories about the same events. You cannot stop telling stories. The mind does not have that option. What you can do is become a more careful, more honest, more self-aware narrator of your own experience. Because the story you are telling is not just about what happened. It is determining what happens next.